Joining me now from the foyer, we've also got James Bezan, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Defence Minister. Jack Harris is the NDP's Defence Critic, and Joyce Murray is the Liberal Defence Critic. Welcome to all three of you. Mr. Harris, I'll start with you. Why did the NDP decide to oppose this mission?
Well, this is a very serious day and a very serious turn of events. We've gone from a mild-sounding advise and assist mission for 30 days to a 6-month mission of bombing with supposedly no ground contact and no combat. That obviously changed, evolved, I think is the phrase. We were not told the truth by the Prime Minister in the House of Commons, and now 6 months later we're talking adding another year, and the Prime Minister went so far today as to say that's not the end of it. We're there till the bitter end, and it's confirmed by Minister Kenny now. We're really, as a country, taking ownership of this war. We're going to be there till the bitter end, and that's a brand new scenario into another country without their consent. That's the first time for Canada, I believe, and with dubious legal grounds being offered. And I think that that's something that is contrary to what Canadians are used to having, but there's very strong appetite by this government to ramp up the war machine and get involved, something that, as you pointed out in your discussion, Mr. Kenny, he didn't have the answers. What happens to this territory if you manage to take it over? We had Colonel George Petrolikas quoted in the Globe yesterday as saying, it will take a lot more planes involved in the battle and tens of thousands of troops on the ground to make a dent in ISIS in Syria. That's not going to happen anytime very soon. And Canadian involvement in this, we're going to be up to our knees in this and higher before too long. This is something that looks very, very frightening to us, saying that we don't want this. There's a role for Canada to play here, but that's not the role for us.
Let me just ask you. The government's view is, you want to do humanitarian aid, the NDP. They say we're doing it anyway. Well, and then you could do both. But you can't have aid without security, and they need security. And they're accusing your party of doing nothing to actually try to defeat what they say could become essentially a terror state. What's your response to that? Well,
there's several approaches that this government is taking. First of all, they're saying that ISIL is a threat to Canada and is going to attack Canada. The two incidents that have occurred that may have a relation that or be inspired by that seem to have been inspired by Canada's engagement, not by ISIL having a direct approach. So this is
So you don't believe that ISIS is threatening Canada?
I don't, Mr. Kenny says that ISIS has declared war on Canada. I haven't heard anybody say that except Mr. Kenny and Mr. Harper and the government. Obviously, they are a terrorist organization that are encouraging people to take actions in Canada and elsewhere. But that's hardly a declaration of war by a state that doesn't have any forces to send anywhere.
You're out of state.
Well, by a claimed state that doesn't have any ability to send anybody anywhere. There's nothing being done in Canada to ramp up do what the Security Council resolution that they refer to in this motion says, which is how do we counter the ability of fighters to go elsewhere? Where's the counter-terrorism strategy that communities are crying out for? The RCMP is crying out for.
Okay, but that's a different issue.
None of those things are being done. They have one approach. There is some humanitarian being done, but we have tremendous capability to help out refugees.
But their argument you can do both. All right, their argument you can do both. But what do you make of Jason Kenney and the Prime Minister saying that, in fact, they have a legal justification to go into Syria because they are invited by the Iraqis to go in and fight ISIS in Iraq, and if ISIS is based in Syria, therefore that extends their legal justification over the border into Syria. Do you buy that?
That's a very dubious legal argument. I've heard it before. It's under challenge. I don't think that that's anything that Canada has ever supported before. And we had the Prime Minister, as you pointed out too, and we did today. Mr. Mulcair pointed out today, back in October of last year, and so did I in question period. The reason we weren't going into Syria was because legally we had no request from the Syrian government, and we wouldn't go there without that. All of that has changed. The mission has changed. The goals have supposedly changed. Now we're going to somehow defeat this organization, which is all over the place and pops up in areas where there's a power vacuum, by doing it from the air. I don't think that's realistic, but it is it is serious enough to get Canada embroiled for a very, very, very long time in an area that we don't know very much about, and we don't know what the end result was going to be. We saw what happened in Libya. Canada has some responsibility for that, frankly, for carrying on and doing something that left the vacuum that created the chaos that's there now, and ISIL troops and ISIL forces in there as well. So this is, we're getting into something we know very little about. This is an area that really should solve its own problems. We have Arab countries around there, Saudi Arabians and all of that.
Let me bring in Joyce Murray. Joyce Murray, your party has decided also not to support the expansion and extension of the mission. Why?
That's correct, because we don't see it as being in the Canadian national interest. And the national interest is supported when there is clarity about a mission, when there is an exit strategy, and when there's transparency and honesty. And frankly, the motion that was just proposed is for an unclear and potentially endless mission. It actually, there's a year. It ends in March of next year, so there is I mean, they certainly could end it next year. Why? Can you clarify this national interest test? Yes.
The Liberals say it's in the national interest to provide aid. The Liberals say it would be in the national interest to train. The Liberals say it would be in the national interest to have the United States and its allies do the bombing, just not Canada. I don't understand how, therefore, it's not in the national interest of Canada.
Okay, so let's just go back to something else you said about it ending in a year. The minister has already, and the foreign affairs minister have been out publicly saying that the comparable mission is Afghanistan, which we know lasted for 10 years. So this mission creep is unlikely to stop at the end of this 12-month session.
But is that, again, the Liberals got us into Afghanistan. Are you suggesting that, the 10 years in Afghanistan, in the end, that was a mistake? That that was the wrong mission because of mission creep? Does that necessarily undermine the justification for that mission? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is this mission is unclear and potentially will be involved in a long time. That's one. Two, there is no clear objectives and no clear exit strategy and no clear plan because there's no objectives.
They're clear. Just to be clear now, Jason Kenney was just on the program and he said the objective is to defeat ISIS.
Yes, and we know that there is quite a fluid flow between different organizations, so when exactly that would be accomplished is a big question. But let me give you some other reasons this is not in the national interest. It is certainly not something that we support as a Liberal Party of Canada to help Bashar al-Assad consolidate his power. And that seems to me what the government is proposing.
Do you think do you believe that by bombing in Syria, do you now believe that the United States is de facto allied with the Assad regime and is helping them consolidate power?
Well, I know that the Prime Minister talked about going into Syria with a bombing mission at the request of Mr. al-Assad. Now they're talking about some other rationale, but in fact that might be the outcome. And when this is a murderous president who has committed violent terrorist acts on his own citizens, this is not in Canada's national interest to help him consolidate his power.
Fair enough. I just quickly, just for time, but the U.S. is doing it. So is the Liberal argument that the U.S. is a de facto ally of the Assad regime now?
The Liberals' argument is the national interest, our Canadian national interest is served when there is a clear, transparent mission with a plan and an exit strategy, and that's not the case with this particular mission.
And finally,
finally, it also is it needs to have honesty and transparency, and that has been missing from the beginning, where we saw the combat behind the wire role morph into something right at the front lines. So this is.
Finally, Joyce, if there's an election between now and the end of the mission, if the Liberals were to win and you would become the government, would the Liberals pull the CF-18s and the Special Forces out?
Well, what the Liberal government would do would be to move this towards being more of non-combat mission that had a much larger humanitarian component, both with refugees in Canada and the refugees that are destabilizing the region. And that's a huge risk that is not being addressed through this motion.
But would you take, would you pull the jets out?
What we would do is we would shift into being a non-combat training mission, a humanitarian mission, and yes, we would gradually withdraw the CF-18s in a way that is responsible, practical, and also as quickly as we could.
Jack Harris, would the NDP, if you win government, would your party take the troops, the training troops, and the CF-18s out both of Syria and Iraq?
I think what's been said is that a new government, of course, would have a new mandate, and we would bring the matter back to Parliament. You know the direction we're heading in it. We don't support the mission. We don't support going into Syria. Obviously, we'd look at what was going on at the time, but our move would be to bring our troops back and to try to find a better way to help the situation. The one thing I didn't get to mention because we were talking about Syria, but up around Tikrit, there's also a huge influence of Iran coming on board here, and with the Shia militias being run by the Revolutionary Guards. If we're going to pull away from that, we've got the Shias coming in, we've got the Kurds who want their own state. If we're going to be abandoning all of that, this whole area could look very, very different in a year or two's time. And we don't know what's going on, and we're really out of our depth here in dealing with this very complex fight between the Shias and the Sunnis that involves all kinds of local players. And we aren't amongst them.
I got a minute here for Mr. Bezan, who's patiently been waiting. Mr. Bezan, and we had Jason Kenney on earlier, which is why you're kind of getting the last word in here. Mr. Bezan, two things. Let me show you what your minister said, that the new goal of the mission. This is new. Let me just play you a clip. This is Jason Kenney saying what the new goal of this mission is.
Initially, of course, we wanted to contain and degrade ISIL. We've begun to succeed in achieving that initial objective. The ultimate objective, of course, is to defeat this organization so that it can no longer pretend to be operating a state or a quasi-state.
So there's been a change. Initially, your goal was to degrade, now and contain. Now it's defeat. Can you tell us what defeat means? What happens inside Syria if ISIS is defeated? What do you mean by that?
Well, we want to make sure that ISIL doesn't have the ability to continue on with its genocidal death killings that they're doing right across the region, or attack us here in Canada. The one thing that we haven't heard from the opposition, either in the leaders' speeches earlier today or what we're hearing from Joyce and Jack right now, is that there is a serious security threat to Canada. And we've had ISIL go out and say that they want to encourage more attacks here in Canada. They've laid out different Canadian areas as targets.
I don't want. There's going to be a lot of politics. Could you just answer the specific question? Because the criticism is, it's easy to get into these things. It's tough to get out. Now that Canada's helping to bomb ISIS in Syria, and now that the new goal, the government is explicitly saying we are going to defeat them. That's the goal. We're going to be in this to defeat them. What happens in Syria after? If they're defeated, and the government has argued that you're making progress in Iraq, I assume if that happens in Syria, what's the plan? Who do you turn over territory in Syria to once they're defeated? Assad?
Well, for sure not Assad, as we've already said.
Who takes over?
Assad is not a partner in the coalition in any way, shape, or form.
But who takes over?
Well, we already have the United States and other coalition partners that are engaging in a diplomatic solution to the civil war in Syria. But what our goal is very, and what you can see in the motion, is that we're dealing with the ISIL terrorist threat, working under Article 51 of the UN Charter to the collective right of self-defense. The Iraqi government has said that they want to have ISIL eradicated, but we're going to go in there and do what we can with our assets to the best of our ability to ultimately bring an end to ISIL and the genocide that they've been carrying out, and of course their threats that they have in Canada and to our Western allies.
All right, James Bezan, Jack Harris, and Joyce Murray. An absolutely critical debate going on right now. The motion is soon to be tabled. This morning, of course, the first opening remarks, and now this debate will continue throughout the week. Always good to have the three of you on. Very interesting debate. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Coming up.